So rather than these guys talking more about the environmental side, obviously we recently had the BBC documentary Asperger and Me. We wanted to talk a bit more about that. So kind of, I think the first kind of opening of the programme, you kind of say that over your 30 years in television, you've tried your best to act normal, whatever normal may be. So if you kind of compare kind of on-camera Chris, should we say, off-camera Chris, what's the kind of main differences between the two?
I suppose outside of my own company and of those and those that the small number of people that I interact with sort of socially, I have a management strategy which means that I can essentially do my job properly, and I can do my job properly because I facilitate other people being able to do theirs, and so therefore I have to comply to certain social norms. So that's something that I became consciously aware of in my early to mid-20s, and I sort of thought, you know, I have a skill set which might be useful and I may well be able to utilise productively, both for myself and maybe for others. But what I can't do at this point in time what I don't have at that, you know, didn't have at that point in time was a framework where I could exercise that. So I sat down and made lists, quite literally, about what I would need to do in order to be functional professionally. Because up until that point, you know, I'd been able to do what I needed to do in isolation. From then on, I needed to work with teams of people. So I was very comfortable about the, you know, other practical aspects of what I needed to achieve, but not that. And I maintain it to this day. You know, there are certain things that I have to consciously think about. I mean, I think that in the interim period, if you do something enough, it becomes a habit. And so there are some of the things now that I don't have to spend too much time thinking about because they've become habitual. Some of them are quite crude. They're highly visible to other people. Other things I think are sufficiently subtle that they don't ever notice them. But on occasion, I still have two jobs to do. And the job is, one, managing myself, and the other is whatever the task at hand is. And if that becomes too onerous, it can be quite exhausting. I'm not saying it ever fails, but in the past it certainly was a real imposition. When I started, I spent probably more time concentrating on getting myself right than I did concentrating on the actual job at hand. And
it's been quite a while since, it was only recently actually that you came out and said that you've been diagnosed with Asperger. So why did you decide to hide it for so long?
I don't think I'd hid it at all, actually, from anyone who knew me. I think everyone knew. Well, they would tell me. And so it was, and even within a professional environment, to be honest with you. On screen, obviously not, but behind the scenes, everyone figured things out. I think that we've got to a point whereby, well, there are two things. Firstly, we have got, our UK society has got to a point whereby we are more accepting of these things being discussed in a positive way, and only through discussing them openly and giving them a platform are we able to affect that same, you know, creative change that I spoke of when it came to human population growth. We've got to discuss things. If we discuss them, we understand them better, and if wider society can understand the needs of autistic people, then they can help them facilitate an environment whereby they can be more fulfilled. And that can be, whether it's a lecture theatre here at Linc University, a job or at home or whatever. I mean, and basically, as I was saying to someone at lunchtime, the amount of effort that is required in some instances is minimal, absolutely minimal, in terms of being able to facilitate someone who's slightly different than you being able to sit alongside you in that lecture theatre and take advantage of the same learning opportunities. So I'm very keen to do that. You know, I worked my way through a very difficult time where the situation was undiagnosable, up to the point that it was, you know, became a diagnosed condition. And I think now, again, given that I have a voice, albeit a small voice, you know, I have to exercise that voice for positive change. That's what I'm here for. Otherwise, I'm not achieving anything, and I've got to achieve something every single day. Otherwise, I'm wasting my time. So I chose to talk about it initially in a book that I wrote, and then through the programme. I have to say the response has been enormously positive, and I hope that more people are able to speak about it, and it does, you know, help those who have the condition to, as I say, to live more fulfilled lives, basically.
And you weren't actually diagnosed until in your 40s.
That's
Is
right.
there what kind of led you to at that point go, right, okay, I need to get properly diagnosed for this? Was there like one sort of turning point or one moment where you realised that it was time to get this properly diagnosed?
Yeah, indirectly, I suppose. I mean, I happened to be, dating nurses quite a lot in the 1990s, early 90s, and it was at that time that autism and Asperger's in particular was coming into the sort of medical consciousness, call it that. It wasn't quite in the public consciousness, but within the medical world it was being discussed and talked about. And one of these ladies said to me once, I've got to have a conversation with you about this, and she started to point a few things out, and then I found a letter that I'd written, a diary entry from the early 90s, where I'd run through a whole list of things which was compatible with things that I was researching. So to be quite honest with you, by the time I got to the diagnosis, others than myself had kind of pretty much figured it out. The reason that the diagnosis eventually happened was that one of the downsides of Asperger's, and they're not all down, I have to be very clear about that, but one of the downsides is that when we get depressed, we get very depressed, and we're not easy to help because we don't really engage with people. We don't really care about what they think. And it's not natural for us to sort of reach out to them. But at that point, just like everyone else, we can be very much in need of help. And I think that there's another great misconception with mental health in this country, and that is that the help should come from people who care about you. But that's a fallacy from my perspective. They're not healthcare professionals. Of course they care about you, but that doesn't mean that they have the skills to actually help you. And for people with Asperger's in particular, other people's concern is of no value to us whatsoever. So when I got depressed and my family were concerned, understandably, and my one or two friends were concerned, it didn't make a difference because they didn't have the skills. Their concern wasn't going to solve the problem. And I think that's probably the case with an enormous amount of, not forget Asperger's, but an enormous amount of mental health conditions. Of course, people really care about them, but they're not in the best place to look after them. What they need is professional help. And at that point, I decided that I would get professional help because I didn't want to go back to this position again. And off the back of that psychotherapy that I undertook at that time, which was helpful, albeit in a slightly unusual way, it was suggested that I got the diagnosis. So that's why I eventually did it.
And in this documentary, you went over to the US to see about these kind of attempts to kind of at least control, or some go as far as to try and cure Asperger's and autism. In terms of the kind of your time in the US and then obviously now living here, how did the two kind of attitudes towards autism and Asperger's compare over in the States and then over here?
There was quite a stark contrast. I think, and it's a cultural difference as well, I think, as well as just being the way that we treat autistic people. Firstly, I think what you've got to realise is that in the 1990s, when the structure of the diagnosis was changed, the number of people diagnosed very rapidly increased. And there was even a thought at some point that there was a new, they called it the plague of autism. So basically that there were more autistic people in society. Now with the retrospective reanalysis of the data, that is not true. What changed was the number of people being diagnosed, not the number of people with the condition. However, when the people were diagnosed and given that diagnosis and they got of that condition, to some people, they became a resource, because these were people who were ill and therefore needed help. And they previously weren't part of our population. If you had cancer, you were very definitely ill and very definitely in need of help. If you had toothache, it didn't matter what it was. If it was a physical problem, there were therapies and treatments there. All of a sudden, you've got this enormous, growing number of people who apparently needed help, but there were no treatments. So frankly, that's a business opportunity. And the one thing that I saw in America, which we weren't able to include in our film, it's a limited amount, you get into an hour, was that, this is a multi-billion-pound industry treating autistic people. The problem was that there was no immediate treatment on the table. there had been no research done, or little research that had been done, because it was an unknown condition. And all of a sudden, you've got a large number of people apparently needing treatment. That's a business opportunity. What can we give them in terms of an actual, tried and tested and effective treatment? Well, there aren't many there, so let's have a go at this one. And that's what we see. And the difference in the United States is that someone can come up with a form of treatment and you can buy it even before it's proven to work. Now, you can't do that in the UK. So in the United States, we went to a very well thought of university, understatement, Brown's University is one of the leading universities in the world, where they're conducting trials with something called TMS, it's magnetic resonance, being targeted at parts of the brain. So this is a trial, it's a test. This is being seen, can it be seen to be having any work? It's years away from being peer-reviewed and proved. But if you've got a few $1,000s, you can go around the corner and you can pay for that now, untested. I mean, it's essentially, it could be snake oil. It might work. It might be refined. It might work at some stage in the future. At this point in time, there's no proven, no proof that it works at all. But in the United States, you can go and pay for it. And a lot of people who are very desperate because, where they stand on the autistic spectrum is very different than myself. Whether it's them or their family, they're desperate for a solution. And if they have the money, they go and pay for it. And it doesn't work. I'm not saying TMS doesn't work. It may well do in the future, but these treatments, such as that are untried and untested, just simply don't work. Now, fortunately, in the UK, legislation is different. We can't do that. There's another form of treatment called, they call it ABA. It's behavioural replacement therapy. And again, so there has been some science done behind that. And we know that in certain situations, it does work whilst the therapy is being implemented. But when the therapy stops, there's a very rapid drop-off in any of the improvements that are seen. So unless you can afford to pay for that therapy all of your life, then it's not the way to go. And in most healthcare systems, United States, case in part, same as in the UK, you get to a certain point where the funding stops. And when the funding stops, the treatment won't work. So we were raising questions about the efficacy and the ethics of these types of treatment. I have to say ABA is now practiced in the UK, and one of the few negative aspects to the programme is that in the aftermath we've faced some criticism from the fraternity of people who are using that, because they say that we didn't represent it fairly. In fact, it was my personal view, and we were very careful to make sure that we were very clear in what we said about it, and that we did represent it fairly. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough field. There's an enormous amount more work needs to be done before we come up with any form of effective therapies. And then the other large question that we raised was, is there across all of the autistic spectrum, is therapy actually required? Do we need to normalise people, effectively cure them of their autism, or do we need society to accept them? And I would argue that on some parts of the spectrum, it's society that should be more tolerant and more flexible and more understanding, and that will solve the problem.